Hello, good morning from Washington, D.C., from New York, from Ottawa, and from Brussels. My name is Bart van Ark. I'm Chief Economist at the Conference Board. I'm here today at the Committee for Economic Development, our sister organization here in D.C. Welcome to this monthly window on, which always is on timely topics, and of course this month on a very timely topic, which are the trade policy measures. Thank you for joining us. We've got a terrific panel, which I will introduce to you in a minute. This obviously is a topic that's very important. A lot of movements, events and responses right now. And clearly there's something that needs to happen at something that has increasingly begun to look like an unlevel playing field in global trade. There are many dossiers that we'll be addressing today. Of course, there is the renegotiation of NAFTA. There are the possible and partly already implemented tariffs on steel and aluminium. There's the use of Section 301 of the Trade Act with regard to tariff and investment restrictions with regard to China. And it all happens at a very rapid speed. So even during this webcast, we may already see changes happening right now. So we're right in the middle of this. But there's no doubt that that is very important what is going on right now and that we need to begin to address what the possible implications of that are. So in this webcast, we are actually going to address all of these topics. We're going to start this webcast with a review of basically what is currently going on at the moment. Then we'll spend some time on what the responses are from other parts of the world, notably the responses from Canada, from Europe, and the response from China. And then we'll get to a very important topic at the end, and that is, will this in the end, and how can get us in the end to a better place where we believe that free trade is important in order to create a level playing field that will help the global economy. Before I introduce the panel, let me emphasize that both the Conference Board and the Committee for Economic Development, as well as the Conference Board of Canada, are non-partisan organizations. So we will be in this webcast very balanced in our views. There are different views, and we will express them. We also like to hear your views on those questions, and we will address them as much in the webcast as we can. We have a fantastic panel today, and I want to move very quickly forward to introduce them. First of all, we go to our studio in New York, where first of all, we have Stefan Zelig. Stefan Zelig is the former Secretary of Trade under the Obama government, and currently he is also managing partner and founder of Bridgeport Advisor. Stefan, welcome for joining us today from New York.
Bart, delighted to be here today. Thank you so much for your invitation.
Great. And next to Stefan is a regular, frequent attender to the webcast, Stephen Kramer-Flood. Stephen is our director, our China Center, engagement director on our China Center, based in our New York office, and even, of course, will give us the insights from the China perspective today. Even great to have you on again.
Always a pleasure to be here, Bart.
And then we go to our sister organization in Ottawa, where we have joining us today Pedro Nunez. Pedro is an executive director of the Economic Outlook and Analysis, chief economist of Canada. And he will, of course, join us today to talk about the impact on one of our most important trading partners, Canada, but also talk more broadly about the impacts on NAFTA and the negotiations that are ongoing there. Pedro, great to have you on.
Well, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
Fantastic. And then we go back to our studio here at the Committee for Economic Development in Washington, and next to me is Steve Otland. Steve is the CEO of the Committee for Economic Development, and we'll actually start off this webcast just in a second to talk about how to interpret what is going on right now here within the Beltway. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
All right. So, a few remarks before we go into the content. Of course, we want you to participate in this webcast. You can do that by asking questions, and that you can do by filling out. Please do so throughout the webcast. We can see the questions appear here on the screen, and during the conversation, I will try to read them in. You can download the presentation. That's actually not so relevant today because we don't really have all that many slides. But what is very important is that you can download the on-demand webcast that is coming available a couple of hours, up to about 24 hours after this webcast. So if there are other colleagues in your organization or other people you want to draw their attention to this webcast, please do so, and they can go to our website and get it available on demand. And you can, of course, then share that as you like. some of you are joining here today and are able to earn CPE credits. So if you are eligible for CPE credits, then please make sure that you fill out the box that appears on your screen during the webcast. You have to stay on these boxes, and of course, you only get the CPE credits when you're attending today live and not in the on-demand version. So with that, I think we can go right away to the content, and one way to hear directly from you is to take a look at sort of what your immediate views are about what is going on right now. So we're putting up a couple of poll questions, and you can answer to the first poll question right now, which is going to appear on your screen. And that's a statement that asks you whether the upheaval in trade policy that we're currently looking at, whether or not you think that's the biggest threat for the recovery of the global economy. And there are two possible yeses and two possible nos. You could say yes, we think that's a threat to the global economy because it will create trade wars and it could lead to a global economic downturn. You could say yes because you think there may be short-term pain for financial markets and global trade, but it's the price we've got to pay. You could say no, it's not going to have a big effect. The global economy won't change much in the end. Or you could say no, it may have some effect, but the confidence in the global economy is so strong that it will ultimately benefit from these actions. So give you a little bit of time because these are somewhat complex questions to being asked that are really, of course, very different perspectives, and we'll keep it open for about another 10 seconds, and then I'll very quickly ask each of our panel members, starting with Steve on the right of me, sort of first reflection on what you're hearing. So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and we're going to close it now. So roughly, almost everybody thinks this is important and has major implications. But people are a little bit split between, this is going to be bad, it's going to create a trade wars and a global downturn. And some people say, well, it will have some impacts on financial markets, but, in the end, that's worth the price. Steve, very quickly, first response.
Well, it's not surprising. This is what the media has been telling us. It's what all of the political class in virtually every country has been saying. It's been what every business leader has been saying. And the question is it true?
Right. That's what we're going to look at. Go to our friends in New York. Stefan, first quick response. Does that make sense, what you see here?
Yeah, I'm a little bit more skeptical about this devolving into a full-scale trade war. I think clearly there are going to be implications, and you're going to see the sort of volatility in the market that you've seen since the metals tariffs were announced. But I am not yet concerned that this will go all the way to what the first answer suggests.
Ethan.
Yeah, well, I'm coming at this from the China perspective, and it's interesting that we're exactly split between number 1 and number 2, because in some respects it's going to come down to China's response to all of this to see which one of these paths we go down. Are we heading for an all-out trade war and a global economic downturn? That might be the case if they choose to prosecute a trade war against us in response to this. Or it could be number 2, right, where we end up with a more balanced and level playing field if concessions are offered and some sort of negotiated settlement is resolved.
Pedro, is this the sentiment in Canada?
Yeah, I think similar sentiment for me. I'm not surprised about the answers, focusing in on there will be problems and how deep those problems will be. I think certainly from a Canadian perspective, we're very worried. We do have a lot to lose, more so with respect to the NAFTA issues than perhaps a U.S.-China trade war. But in any case, any of those outcomes would be fairly bad news for us.
And Ilaria, finally, what's the thinking in Europe here? Is that what you sort of see happening in Europe right now, this sentiment?
Also on this side of the world, but I think that's not the biggest threat to the global economy. I think we are forgetting that the biggest threat at the end of the day is aging. It's a demographic pressure, because that is going to have an impact on our capacity to grow in the long term. And we have dealt with tariffs somehow in the past, whereas the aging challenge is entirely new here. And that's, I think, the biggest threat. Okay,
very good. Steve, let's go right away and try to understand what does the administration try to achieve here, to explain it.
Yeah, so just a couple of the facts. I think we all know that on March 1st, the administration announced 25% tariffs on steel, 10% on aluminum imports. They followed in March 22nd with a $50 billion worth of Chinese imports having tariffs on them following a long investigation. I did spend some time a little over a week ago with our U.S. Commerce Secretary, Wilbur Ross, and I heard a private explanation of their strategy and their point of view. And I thought it was very useful because it's not a point of view that's being displayed in any of the media. He emphasized that despite the fact that these tariffs were levied globally, that the issue that the United States has is with one country, and it's China. Chinese steel imports, though, only make up about 3% of the total imports, and imports to the U.S. make up about 25% of the total steel usage. So that he emphasized that this action would have extremely little effect to no effect. In fact, they expect no effect on the U.S. economy. He emphasized that this is not about having a trade war. They don't want a trade war, and they don't believe they're going to have a trade war. What they're trying to do is to take action that will stimulate a response that will shake people such that they understand that the administration is serious and bring them to the table. What they've said is, we've been following the same pattern for the last several administrations, for decades, in fact, and we have had no progress. So this is, in fact, intended to try something differently. Interestingly, you and I were with Ambassador Susan Schwab, a former trade rep, last night, and she had just returned from China, where she had said that that some of the people privately were saying, sometimes a little crazy isn't bad. And so I think a lot of people say this is crazy, and the question is that the case? I think net, the administration is not trying to stimulate a trade war. They're trying to bring parties to the table. And I think, Bart, you just have to look at some of the actions in the past week to maybe scratch your head and say maybe a little crazy isn't all that bad, as China has come to the table for the first time, quietly trying to seek resolution for this, and South Korea also has come to the table, not unlike Canada and Mexico, who came to the table following a little saber rattling on NAFTA. So I think this is all about tactics, Bart, and I think the strategy for the U.S. is really largely unchanged from trade strategy. They're coming at it differently, and they are, in fact, scaring people.
Right. Stefan, let's go to you. You've been in this for a long time. So I think the question, to Steve's point, is, was this indeed unavoidable? We had to sort of change the tune here. Did you see this coming, that we had to do something really different? And do the tactics that we're talking about right now, do they translate themselves into a strategy?
Bart, I think that is actually the very question, because I think it is clear that U.S. businesses have not been operating on a level playing field. Steve talked about the issues in metals. And as the Secretary of Commerce said, the issues in metals is largely because of overcapacity in the Chinese market, which accounts for over half of global overcapacity in steel. And there has not been an effective policy address to that problem for a long time. It has caused prices to go down globally. It has caused massive pain in the U.S. as companies have gone out of business and workers have lost their jobs. The question is, have the policies that have been put in place today, do we expect them to be effective? And I am skeptical that that will be the case. Tariffs, as you know, are a blunt instrument. And despite what the Secretary said about really only focusing on China, the exemptions that have been put in place today only account for half of steel overcapacity and don't really address China. And we were looking to do this ourselves. And I would just take issue with one of the things Ilaria mentioned about the biggest problem. And I think she mentioned global aging of the population. I think the biggest issue that is going to come from this is a real fissure in the global world order and how we address these issues. And these are global issues, and at least it's my view that global problems demand global solutions, and it's not something that the U.S. is well positioned to address on its own.
What could have been an other way, in your view, to approach this? So, if you would still be in an administration right now, what would have been the alternative? If we just assume it was unavoidable, we had to do something.
Well, I guess I'd start with Steve's point, which I agree with, which is what has been done to date has not been effective. And so I do give the administration credit for mixing it up and trying something new. But I would have been working with our friends and our allies more closely to try and address this issue with China in its totality, and trying to create a solution that way, as opposed to unilaterally applying tariffs to metals ourselves.
Steve.
Well, it's interesting, and Stefan is a CED trustee, and we've worked a little bit together on this, Stefan. But the Secretary also said reminded us, and I was with a group of CEOs and steel executives who were in the room as well. He reminded us that in May of 2017, the EU imposed duties of 29 to 55% tariffs on Chinese firms on these exact same issues. And so he intimated, without giving away confidences, that this was coordinated with our European allies, and that in fact the exemptions already on Canada and Mexico counts for over a fourth, probably a third of our total imports. So his point was, understand what we're trying to do, trust us in how we're trying to do it, because what we've done before hasn't worked. And so anyway, I'm not trying to endorse the point of view, I'm just trying to explain
but
that.
I would just say one thing, Bart, which is the question is, I believe, is this going to likely precipitate a change in Chinese policy? I'm sure we'll hear from Ethan on this later. But the fact is that China is in a very difficult position because they've taken hundreds of millions of their population out of rural settings, brought them into cities, largely into these manufacturing jobs. And the notion that they are just going to quickly close these factories and create massive unemployment to be responsive to our issue, I think, is somewhat naive.
Okay. So let's go to Ilaria and Brussels. Do you have the impression, Ilaria, that the European policymakers feel they have been consulted? Surely, Lighthizer came to Brussels 2 weeks ago to talk extensively with the European Commissioner around this. Do you feel that there's a feeling like, yes, we have been consulted, we have been part of this game, or does Europe feel very sort of on the sidelines here?
I think it's the second. I think the strategy of the Assad administration has a very irritating effect on the European institutions, because also you should not forget, the European Commission is a big bureaucracy. They operate by the rules, and everything that comes out in a disordered way is perceived as irritating. Now, of course, there is not a single voice in Europe. One, of course, is the institutions in Brussels, but and they're not happy with the way things are being processed. But there are also leaders in every country, and I'm sure that there are some of them that are happy about this move. And I'm thinking, for example, of the parties that won the recent elections in Italy, for example.
But clearly there has been a lot of debate in Europe that something had to be done, that the China situation was not sustainable, also not for the Europeans. So in a way you could say the Europeans in the end should be happy that the US administration is moving forward. You may not agree with the tactics, but with the strategy, that might actually be exactly what needs to be done now.
Well, in a way, the way this is done matters, because both the EU and the US have been dealing with this issue of overcapacity that we've been discussing in other webcasts at least a year and a half ago, if I remember well. So the problem has been there, but the way that it is dealt with makes a difference, whether it goes through the formal procedures of the WTO, whether it's done in an organized way, whether it follows the multilateral, the idea of multilateral agreements and rules, and I think this is perceived as disturbing.
So Pedro, from Canada, right? Do the Canadian policymakers feel that they have been consulted, that they are part of this debate, or is it obviously the NAFTA thing going on at the same time? Were they taken by surprise here?
Well, I don't know that I can speak to exactly what the politicians may have been privy to, but certainly I think the impression is that we have not been consulted, especially on this latest aluminum and steel tariffs. This was very scary, obviously, for Canada at the onset, because Canada is the #1 exporter of aluminum and steel into the U.S. It represents a significant portion, about $28 billion of our exports of steel and aluminum go into the U.S. market. So at first that was very scary. But having said that, I think now that we've been exempted, I think we can take a step back, breathe. And I think the sense is that this is a right strategy. China has come into the WTO 15 years ago on the promise or the expectation that we'd see more market-based economy moving forward. That hasn't really happened with respect to some of the state-owned enterprises. So certainly I would agree with Stefan and some of his viewpoints about something had to be done. And I think the perspective here from the north is that this is perhaps a tactic that may pressure China back to the table and may have some outcomes that are positive with respect to Again, some of these state-owned enterprises managing a lot of the foreign direct investment and the trade, the issues around intellectual property, et cetera.
Bart, one thing I should say also is because a couple of the CEOs asked Secretary Ross about the potential impact on our allies, and he specifically called out the Canadians and the Mexicans, and he said, "Look, we're not going to advertise what our policy, what our strategy is and our tactics are, but be assured we're working with our allies to the north and the south very carefully behind the scenes. They may not always express it the same way because of internal politics, but it will be fine. Trust us on Canada and Mexico. Trust us. This is targeted towards one country."
Right, and we'll discuss in a minute what the Canadian response to that is. But before that, Ivan, this is all about America first. Now, I always say if there's one country who knows how to put itself first, it's China. So from a China perspective, I would say they fully understand what America tries to do here, right? This would not come as a surprise to them.
Oh yeah, they understand, and I think the question going forward is how serious they're going to take it, whether there's going to be negotiations, whether they're going to try and call a bluff and find out that it's not a bluff or find out that it is. But let's move this conversation past the steel tariffs. I understand why we're talking about it now, because that is globally important to all of America's trading partners. But really what's got the attention of China is the Section 301 tariffs, right? That's when things sort of moved into emergency mode. Had this remained only a steel issue, I think you would have seen it roll off China's back. As has been mentioned, they don't import very much to the United States anyway. They are acutely aware of their own overcapacity problems in that industry. They've been working on it for a long time. They're not particularly happy about it. I mean, there's one province in China that produces more steel than the entire United States. It's a drag on their economy. It's a capital vacuum. So this is already an issue. This is an issue that would not have generated any sort of global trade war or even a significant deterioration in U.S.-China relations, in my opinion. However, the Section 301 tariffs that are potentially extremely broad-based and very high level, that is, right? This is coming up dramatically there's two cohorts that we're paying attention to here at the conference board. One, China itself, and of course the government and regulators there, who are feeling very aggrieved, very attacked, and are sort of jumping into action in response to this gambit. And then, of course, American multinational companies that operate in China or with China or compete with China one way or the other that are, I would say, alarmed and uncertain. I wouldn't say by any stretch that there's a consensus that this is bad, right? I mean, we've seen there's nervousness. Business doesn't, for the most part, like volatility and uncertainty. However, over the last several years, there has been a significant sea change in the opinion of U.S. industry in terms of the era of strategic patience with China's reform agenda coming to an end, and that previous ballast that existed where you would always find U.S. industry saying, well, let's not rock the boat too much. We're all making bucket loads of money in China. That period has sort of come to an end, and there is more flexibility and open-mindedness towards these kinds of dramatic moves that may be necessary in order to generate that level playing field. However, as I mentioned in the beginning, we don't actually know what's going to happen, right? This is risky, and it's risky for a lot of American companies as well who have significant operations in China. And in the event that China does not respond to this well, which I think is perfectly plausible, things could become very, very uncomfortable very quickly for a lot of conference board member companies that are operating there. Sure, there's going to be some selected cohorts that would benefit from a tariff regime. There always are. Everyone is in favor of protectionism when it's protecting what they sell. They don't want protectionism when it's defending what they buy.
Let's dive a little deeper into China in a second. But before we do that, I want to go back to one more poll question, because we're now moving a little bit more detail into the international responses now that we have a little bit of the context. Although we'll probably need to spend a bit more time on the context. But let's first do a poll question on the international responses. And the poll question really is, who do you think the greatest beneficiary or beneficiaries of the current events will ultimately be? So one could be everybody, because this will move us more towards a global level playing field, a fair level playing field. You could say it's the U.S. because it will ably get all its allies behind the China action, and it will help us to put U.S. first. Third possibility is actually Canada, because it's actually likely to strengthen Canada's position in NAFTA. They got a lot of more pieces to negotiate on. The third one is Europe, because it now can actually start building a more sustainable with Europe rather than with the US. It could be China itself, simply because China is too big to mess around with, or nobody is going to benefit because trade wars will create a loss for everyone. So take your time. These poll questions are a little bit more complicated, but it's a complicated matter. So read through, take your pick, and we'll give it a couple of seconds, and then Ethan will go back to you and ask you a little bit more about the China response, but also particularly the implications for the multinational companies in China, which you already started to address a little bit in your previous response. So we'll keep it open for a couple of more, or 5 seconds, and then if all the respondents on the panel keep the responses in their minds, then you can respond to that if you like during your comments. So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, we'll stop. So, about half of you really think that nobody's really going to benefit from this because this will lead to trade wars and everything else that is bad. Opinions are a little bit split between other possibilities. One is that the US is ultimately going to benefit. It will manage to actually do things in their interests. Some others are saying, China's going to be benefiting because China is just going to be too big. They can't be pushed around. And there are some people who are optimistic and say this may actually ultimately lead to a global playing field. So keep it in mind. Let's go back, Ethan, continue a little bit where you already started. But in particular, MNCs must be really, really worried operating in China right now because this is a huge uncertainty.
Yeah, they are and they aren't. I mean, I just last night delivered a briefing on this topic to the China CEO of one of America's biggest national champion tech companies. The tariffs themselves, in a practical sense, don't really have any meaning for them. And they didn't have a lot of fear about retaliatory tariffs either in terms of our traditional sense of a trade war. They very much felt that their products are absolutely necessary and irreplaceable, and I think a lot of tech companies feel the same way in China. China is not as well positioned to block out American products across a lot of categories as many in the media would suggest. They just simply don't have any other way to get access to this. Similarly, in aircraft, I wouldn't anticipate this kind of retaliation because that would generate a monopoly for Airbus. However, what they all fear is the kind of domestic soft retaliation that happens for American multinationals inside China who rely on the China market in general as a significant part of their business, a significant element in their stock pricing, a significant element in their overall global revenues. Life can become very, very uncomfortable for them if China chooses to respond badly to this. But I do take issue. 20% of folks said that China has a good chance of coming out the winner in all this. I don't really see a path to that, and I don't think anyone in China does either. This is only bad news for them. The decision, Conference Board proprietary data and every other analyst will tell you that China is not well positioned to prosecute an extended trade war with the United States. The U.S. is in a stronger position to ride something like that out. China's economy is a lot more fragile than they want the world to think it is. All of our underlying data shows over the past 20 years that in fact China's economy has responded to outside shocks much more badly than their publicly acknowledged statistics suggest. They would not come out well in this kind of a conflict. So there's something to be said for this kind of gambit, and we've just seen a change in Korea with the renegotiation of the trade deal there. It is possible, it is conceivable that this administration does extract some concessions from China on this as they are scrambling to avoid a worst-case scenario. But in the meantime, I think most American multinationals expect that they're going to find themselves punished in some way, shape, or form, as this process rolls out.
Actually, I want to go to Stefan because you mentioned the South Korea deal, which just came through yesterday. So, Stefan, do you think it is possible that what happened with the South Korea deal could actually, something like this could emerge for the China-U.S. relationships also?
Well, the question is really what happened, right? So there was an increase in the quotas of American cars that we can now sell in Korea to 50,000 a year from the 25,000 car level, which we don't even hit now, and an extension of the tariffs that we can put in place, the duties for light trucks coming from Korea into the United States when Korea currently doesn't sell a single light truck in the United States. So is it really a win or was it a political win? I would take One kind of exception with what Ethan said, which is, of course, nobody wins in a trade war. Multinational companies' supply chains will be disrupted, prices will go up for consumers, and global growth will slow on the one hand. On the other hand, to the extent that the U.S. is seen having caused this, and China reacts in a measured way, you can imagine potentially they're being perceived to be more legitimate globally, and their stature could rise in the global economy as they're now able to enter into multilateral trade agreements, etc. If the U.S. is perceived to have initiated this, if the U.S. is perceived to have weakened global institutions like the WTO, and to Bart's original question, if the tactics were an ineffective way to address legitimate concerns. And so, a dumbing down of the system doesn't help China directly, but it might help China relatively, which would be a real shame.
Steve?
Look, I have to take the Secretary at his word. He was very clear on this. There will be no trade war. I mean, I understand that the response to the question, if there is a trade war, everybody loses. I think that's accurate, but there will be no trade war. The U.S. says there will be no trade war. If they say there will be no trade war, there will be no trade war. The country that has the most, that needs to be adjusted is China. The U.S. is not going to be viewed as the villain in this because China operated first. It's not the U.S. acting first. It was China, and it's every country outside of China, maybe except North Korea, agrees that China is a violator on these and other issues like the intellectual property issues, and that the actions that are being taken from the North American countries, as well as, remember, EU moved first on this, and so there was some level of coordination for that. I think this is an attempt to move things, and I think it's going to move it just a little bit in the favor of those countries other than China.
So, Ethan, what is the next step that you think China will take now?
Yeah, well, they have a well-worn playbook for managing cycles of U.S. presidents and Western leaders in general, which is to talk and talk and talk and delay and delay and delay. I mean, they've been at the table the whole time, right? These threats didn't bring China to the table. They've always been there. And they are very good at making promises and very good at offering limited concessions, very good at also offering sometimes legitimate win-win outcomes based on the types of reforms that they were already intending to implement domestically. So I mentioned steel and how they are equally unhappy with their steel industry. There's a whole range of other potential liberalizations and marketizations, particularly in the financial industry and across a range of other restrictions where their own technocrats have been pushing for a long time to make some changes that happen to be the types of changes that American multinationals would appreciate as well. And China's very good at slowly feeding these types of reforms out in a way that they can package as concessions to improve trade relations. Now, we saw last year that there was this 100-day trade window followed up by the initial meeting of the Comprehensive Economic Dialogue between the two countries. There was much fanfare at the time about all the great progress that was being made. We had a lot of pronouncements from the administration about what a big deal it all was. I think a lot of us old China hands were saying, no, this is nothing. This is a lot of empty promises from China, and they're going to find out eventually, and that's what happened. And so the wild card is, of course, the current president is, he cultivates his own wild card reputation, and a lot of us said, well, he's going to find out eventually that China's playing by the same old playbook, and they're not really going to deliver on any significant changes, and sure enough, that's what happened. And so now we're at the stage where he's moving to this next level of trying to change the status quo. I question the claim, though, that there isn't going to be a trade war, and that the trade war is not an intention here. I mean, it better be the intention, because if there's any sense that this is all a bluff, China's going to sniff that out really quickly, and they're going to go right back to the old playbook. They're going to make a bunch of promises, and if these Section 301 tariffs sort of peter out or are negotiated away relatively quickly, the needle's not going to move. Right? This has to be serious, or it's a waste of time.
So let's go back to Ilaria for a second. Steve rightly said earlier that actually Europe was even earlier on this topic than the United States. So, it sounds like Europe, in a way, should be happy that things are finally moving, and they may not have succeeded now to keep the initiative. But it seems, the way that I take it is that, they were threatened with these steel and aluminum tariffs that were taken away on the condition that it would support the China-US initiative. So, why would Europe not be actually satisfied, even though they may not want to say it aloud?
Well, I'm not sure I can answer this question in a clear way, because what my feeling is that there is a lot happening behind the scenes on the issue of trade and trade policy. So let me maybe just reconstruct the timeline. What happened last week, this week, is that first thing, European Commissioner Malmström flew to the US, to DC, to negotiate the exemption. And now the idea is to keep the exemption as permanent, because, as you know, unless it's, let's say, renewed, it will expire on May 1st. And this strategy was backed up by the European Parliament, by the Council, so by the head of states and government, by the European Business Confederation. So this was the immediate response to the big headlines that we saw. However, I think the most interesting things are happening outside of this discussion, both looking at the US and China. So with regard to China, a couple of things happened in the last month. The first thing is that the EU is trying to update its trade policy, its trade defense law, to speed it up and to increase its trade response measures in case of anti-dumping. And this is a process that is negotiated between the different institutions and the member states, and it has been going on for about a year. So the next step would be a final approval of this draft law to increase the defense in case of anti-dumping. In case of dumping, and a decision will be taken in May, a final decision will be taken in May in the European Parliament. So this is one thing. Then there's been something else. It started in summer last year in response to an increasing number of takeover of European companies by Chinese owners. So if you look at the data on foreign direct investment of Chinese in Europe, it's really increasing very, very fast. And there's been a few cases during 2016 and 2017 of tech companies, equipment in Germany and in France, so companies being acquired by Chinese companies, and this became at one point very sensitive. So what happened is that three member states, Italy, France, and Germany, asked to the European Commission to create some sort of early warning system to advise against these cases or in favor. And there is no regulation on that yet, but this is a discussion, really, with the idea of preventing the acquisition of strategic firms from Chinese companies here in Europe. So this is also an interesting development, and again, it goes beyond the tariffs and it touches on really sensitive issues. And then there is a third thing with regard to the US. Just last week, the European Commission put on the table a proposal to tax digital companies. And so the timing here, it's interesting, it's difficult. The Commission thought about that for a long time. I mean, it was expected, but the timing, I think it's really interesting because the idea is to tax the 3% of revenues of digital companies and that are above a certain amount of revenues, so 700 million, if I remember well. So they counted that there are about 180 companies that fit in this category, and half of them would be American companies. So the American administration obviously was not happy because this would touch American companies the most. So as you can see, there is a lot happening in the domain of trade policy, and it goes well beyond tariffs. And now we're all talking about tariffs, but I think the interesting things are happening on other fronts, like foreign direct investment and taxation.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. There are a lot of moving pieces. I want to go to Canada in a second, but just want to close this section on China out. Even I want to go back to you because on this investment point that in Europe that Ilaria is making, there's the same issue, of course, in the US. I mean, the CFI US has sort of, also tried to sort of tighten up the rules here. Is this going to play a big role in this whole debate?
Right, and this is potentially a longer range, more enduring change and more enduring ramp up in tensions between the two countries because the way that CFIUS, that you just referenced, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, is its mandate is in line to be dramatically increased based on some legislation running through Congress now. And in fact, part of the announcement last week on the Section 301 tariffs, it was a three-pronged announcement. Everyone paid attention to the tariffs, but there was also an announcement about dramatically ramping up restrictions on inbound Chinese investment in the tech space, and then there was an announcement about a WTO lawsuit as well. But that restriction on Chinese investment in the U.S. in sensitive areas, particularly tech, aligns with legislation going through Congress to mandate CFIUS to expand its remit considerably, not just in the U.S., but even inside China for the activities of U.S. companies that are high-tech companies engaging in partnerships and joint ventures and technology transfer. All of this emerged from the USTR report on IP and the threat to America for our technology transfers, but the kind of changes that they're looking to implement to restrict to draw this barrier between the US and China in the tech space, these are going to be relatively permanent. And there's tremendous bipartisan consensus in favor of it, right? Both political parties, probably the only thing that they agree on in the world is that the US needs to get tougher on China, particularly in this space. There's still free traders out there that don't like the tariffs, but everyone seems to like the idea of blocking Chinese investment.
And in fact, Ethan, I think this is one of the three big sticks we have. So in every conversation, of which I had numerous conversations with my counterparts in China, they essentially cared about three things: being recognized as a market economy for WTO and international stature purposes, one. The ability to invest in the United States, and the ability to have access to dual use and other controlled goods and services from the United States. So to the extent that we address those, as opposed to the narrow tariff issues, I think that is what's going to give us the most leverage to potentially force some of these important changes.
And that would be the optimistic view, would be that this is a leverage maneuver to create more positive win-win outcomes to pry open China's market. A more pessimistic interpretation would be that this is a permanent change in the introduction of a new sort of technology Cold War.
Okay, we're running out of time. We knew we can talk 4 hours about this. We probably spent more time on it. But Pedro, I want to go to the Canadian situation, because Canada is especially complex here, right? Big trader, Canada itself with China, very big trade with the US, and then of course there's the whole NAFTA thing playing here. So the question really is this whole situation going to make the whole NAFTA thing even more complicated and the overall trade relationship with the US? Or is this actually helping to move things forward? And there could actually be some alliance between Canada and the US that could ultimately help here.
Yeah, well, nothing brings folks together like having a common enemy. So, and I think that second point is absolutely right. I'm not exactly sure what triggered the first pass at the tariffs, but certainly what happened following that was a very quick response where all of a sudden Canada and Mexico were exempt from those tariffs. The sense that we have is perhaps the administration got a call from the steel and iron producers in the U.S. suggesting that, or stating that a lot of their exports, 75% of U.S. exports, in fact, go to either north or south to Mexico or Canada. And I think this highlights one thing that we've been talking about for a very long time, which is how integrated we are within the North American supply chain. The metal that the U.S. exports to Canada, of course, ends up in the production process, in the manufacturing sector. It goes south, and we know that, for example, in the auto sector on its own, we see the final good, the final car. The parts within that have gone through the various borders a multitude of times. So this goes to our point again about how important NAFTA is to maintaining and not upsetting that integrated supply chain within North America. So I think those tactics perhaps helped express that sentiment from the industry side, and we have already, since the first announcement of the tariffs, seen some lightening up of concessions. Well, at least we've seen the U.S. ease up with respect to the North American content, or the U.S. content within North American auto production. That's very helpful to a very important sector for Canada, which is the auto sector. So I'm hopeful. I do think that perhaps this will help expedite NAFTA along. And the importance of NAFTA goes beyond just the integrated supply chains. In Canada, since all of this uncertainty has hit around the viability and long-term viability of NAFTA, we have seen investment from the private sector essentially recede. There's so much uncertainty about whether Canadian producers will have access to the U.S. and North American market that essentially they're pulling back, holding out, and waiting to get some of this resolved before making those investment decisions. So this has been a huge and very important issue for Canada over the last year and a half.
Okay, so let's go to the last section, and that's really about how do we manage the risk and how do we ultimately get to a good place here. And again, we want to start with a poll question, again, a long poll question, but really, the question is, how is global business going to be affected most likely by this current situation? And of course, the good and bad things that come out of it. What's the most important thing you think? Is it rising tariffs on a wide range of products? Is it cost increases through distortion of the supply chain? Is it overall slowdown in global trade? Is it retaliatory actions against multinationals in China? Or is there good stuff coming out, which is a better global IP regime as a result of new deals, especially with China? Is it because we'll have a more effective bilateral and perhaps even regional trade deals down the road, or we'll have a significant acceleration in reshoring? So the first four are sort of the most likely kind of negative effect that you might see, or if you're an optimist here, you might choose one of the three more positive effects. So read them through, lots of choices here. And then we'll go into very quick questions to each of the 5 panel members to shed their light or make any kind of closing comments on things that I'd like to address from the perspective of how to manage risks and how to get to a good place. So let's give it a couple of more seconds for you to pick one effect that you think is most likely to impact global business from the current trajectory we're on right now. So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and then we'll close it down. So almost half of you said this is going to lead to cost increases through distortions in global supply chains. This is going to mess up global supply chains, and we have to make adjustments as businesses, and it's going to be very costly. Otherwise, the responses are somewhat divided. Some people saying an overall slowdown in global trade could be a result. Some of the optimists are saying, we might actually get to better bilateral and multilateral trade deals coming out of this. So let's go through some of the issues here, Steve. The question I want to ask you is this issue of these better regional deals that may be coming out. I'm an economist, and sometimes I call myself the naive economist, and I've been trained on textbook economics that, bilateral trade deals are suboptimal. We have to really go for multinational trade deals. I've always been told you've got to be realistic. The real world is different than your textbook economics. That's true. But what should business ask for? Should business ask for this suboptimal solution, or should business push for a real level trade playing field, which are multilateral trade?
I think Stefan would agree that the approach of all trade negotiators has been for multilateral deals. It seems to make the most sense. But I think that there has been these outstanding issues that have had no traction. And this administration has decided that they're going to try a different tack. And Ethan is right. You can't advertise your solutions. You have to be willing to create a trade war in order to be taken serious. I think that's shaken everybody to think that they're going to. I don't think that's going to happen. I think it is tactics in order to drive some better lower playing field. I don't think there's going to be cost increases. So this administration's point of view is let's take everybody on one-on-one, and it's easier to control the variables that way rather than to deal through a condo association. It's easier to deal with one neighbor versus trying to deal with an association that can sometimes then overwhelm a big player like the U.S. in this. And so it's all about how to reassert the U.S. such that the benefits flow a little bit back. So I think that's really what's going on. And I want to come back at the end, and I want to talk about a little geopolitical issue, but I'll save that.
Okay, let's go to Stefan here, because I think if that's true, and you've been working on TPP for a very long time in great detail.
Thanks for reminding me, Bart.
What's that?
Thanks for reminding me.
Yeah, right. For a long time, and I'm sure you felt this was a really good deal, which now been shelved. But ultimately, I guess you still think we need to go back there. Is this the route to ultimately get back there, or is this a route completely the opposite direction and makes it even less likely that we'll get to the trade deals of the 21st century?
Look, the administration has been reasonably consistent in voicing its preference for bilateral deals as opposed to multilateral deals. I think when the Australian PM was in town, the president did raise or open up the window of possibly rejoining TPP, which you know has now been entered into with the other 11 countries. But frankly, I think that is unlikely that we'll see the U.S. Join TPP or other multilateral agreements being entered into in this administration, which I think is a shame for all the right reasons that Steve has suggested. And the fact is, we were the big dog in TPP, and we brought TPP up to a level that I think would not have been achievable without our presence, because we do represent the largest economy in the world and roughly 25% of global GDP. So that gives us, frankly, outsized influence, not the opposite.
Right. So, Pedro, we talked already a little bit about NAFTA, but let's zoom in a little bit on NAFTA, because, talking about sort of regional deals, this is the regional deals. I think everybody agrees that NAFTA needed to be renegotiated. It was a trade deal of the 1990s. Where is it going now, and what are the most important remaining parts of NAFTA that need to get negotiated to get to a good outcome?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think there is going to be there may be some snags still, even though in the latest round we have had some positive signals. I think there's a few snags. The first one is the Chapter 19 negotiation mechanism that we have within NAFTA. The U.S. administration has been opposed to it. We've seen a number of decisions come our way through the tribunals, through the trade tribunals, and I think there's some opposition. So this is a very important piece for Canada. We want to hang on to that, and this could be an issue going forward in terms of finalizing the negotiations. The other, of course, is that the administration claims that Canadian supply chain and quotas and very high tariffs on dairy products and some other ag products are hurting farmers in Wisconsin, and this is in fact quite true. But it's an issue that the Conference Board of Canada has talked about in many research reports about the fact that supply management is hurting us rather than helping us in many respects. But nonetheless, politically, this is very, very difficult for the federal government to address because it affects. Of course, the dairy production or the dairy farmers in certain provinces, or poultry or egg producers in others. So I think the line in the sand may be on the supply management side. Even though, as an economist and a think tank, we here at the Conference Board have been arguing against that. I don't know that we can that we'll see a move on that front possible. And the second is the Chapter 19 arbitration, and I think Canada may find it difficult to concede on that front.
Would Canadian business at this moment benefit most from this being actually a bit on the back burner, or do you think that really this shouldn't drag on for too long and we need to get to a resolution on NAFTA sooner rather than later?
Yeah, no, I think this goes back to my prior point that we've been in a state of uncertainty here, a state of flux ever since even the nomination of the president and his discussion around renegotiating NAFTA. We have seen private investment in Canada reduced over the last number of years. Even though it's kicked back up a little bit recently and business confidence is up, we aren't seeing the investment intentions really coming back to Canada. We've lost out, certainly in the auto sector over the last 5 or 6 years. We have seen a lot of that investment going south to U.S. right-for-work states or to Mexico. We've lost out on the auto sector, but now, we have, with oil prices declining, we are in a situation where our dollar has weakened substantially vis-a-vis the U.S. greenback. So we thought that this would bring back some of that investment. We'd see that, our ability to see our production and exports rise would be benefiting from that. But in fact, the investment hasn't happened at all. And I think a lot of that is due to uncertainty around the resolution of NAFTA. So we're hopeful for a quicker rather than longer resolution for sure.
Okay, Ethan. I don't want to put all the blame here on China, let me be clear. But a lot of this trouble started by China not playing according to WTO rules. And the question really is China now serious about going back to the WTO rules, or are they actually okay with these bilateral deals? And say, we'd rather do the bilateral deals. It's much more in our interest. We're a big power anyway, rather than go back to the WTO and see if we can fix it there.
Yeah, China has, this is an interesting point that you just brought up. China has approached its economic relationships with partner countries in a way that we would now consider familiar, in as much as they have signed a proliferation of bilateral deals, whereas something like the TPP they were not involved with. I'm not sure if that was by choice or by necessity, but they were able to sort of extract the kind of concessionary bilateral trade deals with a lot of their partner countries of the type that we haven't been involved with. But thinking about the Asia-Pacific region and trade deals in general, and the TPP, the problem with multilateral investment, the problem with multilateral trade deals is it's all well and good to pull yourself out of them, but sometimes they keep going without you. And American multinational companies are slowly waking up to the fact that by this time next year, they're going to be in a significantly sort of new competitive disadvantage at 11 countries around the Pacific Rim. Some of whom are major markets. I have heard complaints from U.S. agricultural companies about the disadvantage they face in China because China and Australia have a trade deal, which opens up the Chinese market to Australian ag and services in a way that our companies can't compete with. And now you're going to be facing a scenario where Japan and a whole range of other countries have reduced tariffs for each other, have reduced investment barriers for each other, and have made the business interactions easier for each other and not for American companies. So we all talked about 2 years ago during these conversations, all we were talking about was TPP and whether or not it was going to happen. And then all of a sudden, the U.S. pulls out and we say, oh, it's dead. Well, it turns out it wasn't dead. Right? It's moving forward just fine. And now American companies that operate in all of these countries are going to be disadvantaged vis-a-vis local competitors from all of those other countries. So you asked a sort of big question about the nature of the global trading regime and the rules-based order. The TPP with the U.S. in it had been envisioned as a way to put pressure on China to start following the rules again, or get back into a place where its own reform agenda was moving it closer to a place where it could follow the rules. Arguably right now it can't even follow the rules if it wanted to. The TPP was meant to be a cudgel in that direction. It's probably not really going to do that anymore without the U.S. in it, but this has really turned into a lose-lose scenario for countries that are outside of the TPP, especially now the United States.
So, Ilaria, I can't help to think that Europe has lost the initiative here and given it to the U.S. So the question to you is, no pun intended here, whether Europe still has kind of a trump card.
Did you just say that?
Yeah, I said it, no pun intended. Is there still something going on in Europe that we need to watch out for them to seize back the initiative?
Yes, I'm going to reply to your question, but can I add something on the poll? Because I'm really, really surprised that nobody replied acceleration in reshoring. So just 1 second on this. We just published a study less than 2 weeks ago where we clearly show that there is a consolidation in value chains happening in Western countries. So I'm really surprised that nobody ticked that answer, because this is happening. It has nothing to do with tariffs, because if you look back at the data, it started in 2011. And I'm not a big fan of reshoring, but this consolidation of supply chains is consistent with the idea of reshoring. Anyway, small parenthesis, I will try to reply to your question. But what I was saying before, I think it's the interesting things. I think the limitation on FDIs are the biggest card that Europe wants to play in the trade relationship with China. And if you look actually at trade policy more in general, and the way the EU institutions are positioning themselves in this big debate on globalization, how to handle it, and hostility in our societies, they are pursuing the strategy of insisting on sustainability. I mean, the overall idea, as Ethan also said, is that trade agreements are done to shape trade policy, to attach some rules to import and export, and they want to insist on rules that are related, for example, to sustainable development. And there are even projects, so for example, gender equality, sustainability of supply chains. And there are there is even a small project that is financed by the European Commission and is conducted together with the OECD and the ILO to promote responsible business conduct. They have a pilot project for Asia, and they're now thinking of extending it to South America. So as you can see, this is a bit the strategy of the Commission to present itself as a champion. We still believe trade creates jobs and prosperity. We understand that there is a public concern against it. We have to do something about it, and that something is trade agreements, its rules, and sustainability.
Well, I'm sure that we will dedicate another window program on this trade issue as it is evolving over the next few months. But for now, we're at the top of the hour. So let me first of all thank the panel. I think it was a terrific discussion and try to sort of bring some order to all the noise that we're hearing around us. So Steve Utland, thanks a lot. Stefan Zelig, our guest in the New York studio, and Ethan over there also, thanks a lot. Pedro, great to have you in and hear the Canadian perspective, and Iraya, as always, to have you on the European perspective. I think this is a real global attempt to get some understanding. To wrap things up, next month we are back with a topic, another hot topic right now, which is what is actually happening to productivity. Everybody's been talking about this productivity slowdown. McKinsey put out a big study on this again recently. But what about the productivity uptick as we're beginning to observe in some of our data? So we're putting a panel together there, and we hope you'll join us for that next month. And then, of course, we still have this topic on the agenda to talk about Saudi Arabia. We've postponed it for this month. We're now planning it for May. Major economy, lots of things happening there. So we're hoping to have that addressed in our May window on series. And finally, here are some other resources that you can obtain from the conference board. And of course, as always, I'd like to hear from you in an evaluation of what you think of this program. And we hope to, of course, see you again next month on window on. My name is Bart van Ark, Chief Economist at the conference board, and wish you a great day from Washington, D.C.